Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Christ consciousness. Well, what created the crazy 60s? And, you don't appreciate the 60s unless you. Now, it's actually even a little before my time. But the 60s, which went into the 70s to a degree, but by the time I was through the middle of high school in the mid 70s, at least where I was living, there was now moving into the Reagan times. We're moving into the 80s, and this was a very conservative time, and you really this was kind of a backlash against a lot of the drug culture and everything else, but not really, because the 80s is when everybody had 40 pounds of cocaine, and of course marijuana was still being used heavily and so forth. I'm not sure about hallucinogens and everything else, but since the 60s we've had a major drug movement. And why have we had that? And what happened to all these 60s kids? And a lot of people think everybody just revolted normally. Well, this isn't true. It was pointed out to me recently here, watching some documentaries of why there were so many problems with the 60s and why people just ran away from the actual establishment, the regular way of life. Well, I'm not sure there was a regular way of life. I mean, there certainly was through the 50s and 60s, all the way up to the early 80s, was still a time where you could, as an average person with an average salary, could have a house and a car without much of a problem. You didn't have to work that hard. This started changing towards the mid-80s as real estate shot up and wages stayed the same, if not went down. So they had this opportunity in the 60s. Still was a time where you could buy houses and everything else and get cars for $3,000-$4,000, and certainly pay wasn't that much, but people had enough to get by, apparently. I'm not entirely sure about all that, but you certainly, and you didn't necessarily even need to have a college education. People trained you, you could get decent jobs, etc., even without that, to a degree. So we need to understand this. So what happened? Why did this generation in particular turn? But one thing that has been neglected is the fact of who were their parents. Now, these people were born from the generation, a lot of people like to call it the greatest generation. I'm not sure. I don't know if there's any generation that's great, but there certainly was an entire group of people, an entire country that was focused on survival, and it was called World War II. And the reality of World War II and the sick, perverted minds that came back from there and also fought that war was pretty bad. And there's so much disinformation and misunderstanding, it isn't even funny. But let's also understand what the problem here is. Why did we have such a group of people that were so disenfranchised? Why did we have so many people? And a lot of these people that you saw on the streets and everything else, and there's a combination of things here, and I forget because I don't remember, but apparently in the 60s and 70s, and I was fairly young, at least in the 60s, there were massive race riots all over the country. We don't hear about it. We hear about certain things happening in the South and people trying to get into schools, but apparently there were massive race riots, and this was something that was going on all over the country. And this is something that also put people that have been misunderstood to a large degree, but put people like Charles Manson, the infamous pimp and psychotic, into a tizzy, thinking that this entire world was going to blow up. And of course, these people that have nothing seem to be more concerned about what's going to happen to begin with. But this was something that pushed him over the head, where he wanted to push him over. In reality, he wanted to go live in the desert and do all these things, thinking that there's going to be this giant race riot and that all the white people would be killed, and that he had to hide in the desert, and they were going to then come out of the desert and then tell the new reigning people, which are the blacks, how to run things. which is pretty ridiculous if you think of it to begin with. Why would they follow him? Of course, he came from a time when there was even super high racism. While he wasn't a racist, he had your typical attitude that people had back then, whites did. And that was, there's a subtle prejudice you always have. So the whole idea is that that's what he said. He somehow thought that they would listen to him because he was a smart guy. You know, he had this God complex of everything else. But we have to understand the kind of weird times these are. And as I've been studying this a little bit recently, it was quite weird. But what triggered all this? Why did everybody all of a sudden do this? And you're talking about massive drug use, massive chaos in the street, and you're talking about this whole philosophy that came out of it. And why was that? Well, it's very interesting and overlooked. And what is overlooked in World War II, and what triggered all this on top of hearing this, what triggered all this is that, don't you think people in World War II were traumatized? Don't you think there's, PTSD, which is so popular now? Don't you think these people had these problems? You know, the kind of horrendous things they went through, particularly in the Pacific theater, where life expectancy on Guadalcanal was 3 minutes, where we lost close to 20 to 30,000 men to take that piece of garbage named Okinawa. Nah, that's not tragedy. I mean, the American military was just about devastated by the time we reached Japan. And, of course, the pressure from the Russians and the Chinese, of course, ultimately won the Pacific theater, along with the Australians, the Dutch, the French, and everybody else who was in the Pacific. As I've always said, America is great cannon fodder and has this huge economic background where you can keep sending machines and everything else that get blown up and men because you have huge amounts of population and money. So you can't beat somebody like that because they're going to get you in the long run. But regardless of all that, we've had these traumatized people. And what happened? Well, now we have all sorts of things to help people, supposedly, even though even up until recently, the vets were never taken care of. There's no money for the vets. There's only money for Ukraine. So the whole idea is that we all know that. Billions go to people like that while your vets can't get the medical care they need right up to this day. So what happened? But of course today there's a little more awareness of this, pretty much because they have to, but PTSD is something that's very seriously, and it ain't new. This didn't just happen now. Everybody else was fine before that because they were good, tough people in war. Like hell they were. People went through horrendous things in World War II. The kind of brutality that goes on in any war is shocking. And this happened throughout all of Europe with little or no support. I mean, there wasn't really even very many allies. So the bottom line is this didn't do well. If it wasn't for Russia winning the European war, we would have never won that war. It would have been impossible with the ignorant, poorly led Allied forces. Who didn't like each other. Everybody hated the French. The British didn't like the French. The British didn't like the Americans. The Americans didn't like the British. I mean, this is just comical when you have an enemy that should unite you. But, we had right in our general command, we had a Nazi trying to save Hitler and was overjoyed when he saw the murder of the Jews. So this is what your buddy was all about. George's Patton, they made a film about this retarded psychopath, making him look like a hero. So the whole idea is that what happened? Now, World War II is quite traumatic. This wasn't some sort of cakewalk. This was a major all-out battle which lost a lot of people that we tend to ignore today. Nothing happened. Let's trade with them. Let's go buy some Jappy cars. All the things that go on, which is really horrendous because we all have short memories. And of course in Japan they don't want foreigners. It's hard to rent a place. They don't allow you hardly in there. All the wonderful things you get from people whose ass you lick. So the whole idea is that this is the kind of things that goes on with this. But what happened there? Well, it's very interesting is that I heard this person talk about it, and it's the fact, as he said, that the 60s kids, many of them had to leave home. They were beaten. They were abused. Many were thrown out of their houses, and they didn't have the kind of, I don't know if we have the systems today or not. Generally, they just leave you on the street as it is. I mean, we don't have systems anywhere. We don't have places for people to go like shelters. We have very little. If you can find the system, there's something out there, but good luck finding it. All of these things are something that we need to look at seriously. So the point is, a lot of these kids who decided to move away from regular society were forced to. Their parents were psychopaths. They were beaten, they were raped, and everything else that went on with this from the Great Generation. The Great Generation, like any generation, isn't great. What about the generation that fought in the swamps of Vietnam? They were ingrate? What the hell is that about? They didn't even have a directed enemy. Or even now, as we fight the nebulous enemies in a place we have no business being in called the Middle East for 20 years with no goal whatsoever. So these weren't people taking over the world like Hitler was or the Japs were doing. So I don't want to give anybody credit, and I never do. I'm not going to give anybody any pats on the back. So the facts are the facts. But these people came back with horrible, horrible conditions, and they took it out on their family. Interesting. Now, how can I confirm this? Well, what's very interesting is hearing this person say that. And of course, these kids were driven on the street, driven into these lifestyles, seeking it out because their lives were horrible. And the little that they had of a prosperous society at that time where you could get a decent job, buy a car, etc., may not have even been an option to them. But certainly it was a time where everybody had a certain amount of freedom. But the bottom line is that it was a freedom based on the illusion of taking drugs and hallucinogens. So it was a false reality. If everybody is wasted, then it means that society isn't good. You're living in basically an egotistical mind trip by taking a substance that controls you for whatever period of time it is. And then the only thing you really want to do is go back to that self-created mind control, which is an unending horror. Because you can't stay loaded even very long at all. Certainly not for hours and hours a day. Your body goes down, your mind goes down. This is not good for you. So it's something that people have to be very careful of. And hallucinogens are just a comic book in your mind. They do nothing for you, even though a lot of very low-level people have gotten benefits out of using hallucinogens, LSD, etc. But they're pictures in your mind. They're mental masturbation. A lot of people claim this has broken their connection to regular society. Well, I don't really see that in the long run. They seem to think this is, by seeing goofy pictures, they somehow now have changed. Well, they really haven't, but that is something each individual person has to figure out. I don't really think that's the case. You experience a new reality from regular consciousness that you shift from in a controlled manner, like a trance, and then shift out of it when you're done with it, in a controlled fashion. If not, then you're living a dream. So that's like saying movies are real. Well, was that movie real? Wasn't your dreams real? Well, your dreams are not real. Movies are not real. Whether they assist you or whether they release psychic trance or whether you get into it and you, because you're kind of hypnotized, bring that into you, well, that's all part of the game. But the bottom line is, what did I was looking up someone, I don't know how I found this, but there's a famous World War II veteran called Audie Murphy, a Texas-born, most decorated man in World War II. Kind of a little guy. He did a bunch of movies, though, and was a fairly decent actor. So he did a bunch of movies, westerns, war movies, etc., and he was the most decorated guy. And if you listen to what this guy done, like so many of the heroes out there that we don't hear anything about, combat heroes, which I'm not sure what value they have. They certainly are amazing of what they've done, but in the bigger picture, I'm not sure what it all means. But what they've done is unbelievable. Audie Murphy did amazing things as a single soldier himself, including fight off tanks and everything else by himself. The other people were hiding in the woods. It's amazing what this guy did. And then he came back to Hollywood, and of course he was rewarded. One of the few that was. Being that, and of course he was a pretty good-looking guy. He was a fairly good actor, so he did make quite a few movies. But I was reading about him, and I think he has an actual book out there as well. I've never read his book, but he was talking about the fact of how he had horrible mental problems. and that nobody cared and nobody helped him. Interesting, huh? Oh, no, it only happened in Vietnam. It only happened in the Gulf War. No, it's happened in all the wars. And they've been horribly traumatic. And this heroistic attitude towards war is something that needs to stop. On the other, as well, the fact is that there's too much glamour going into World War II on top of it. But here's a guy, a superhero in the real sense of it, a man that did amazing things in battle. Was horribly traumatized. He drank too much, he had all sorts of problems, and he eventually died young because of this. So the trauma is there. Now, it wasn't him, but that's the kind of guys that came back from World War II, had babies, and then beat, molested, and tortured them, who then ran on the streets in the 60s. Because you got to remember, the war ended in 1945. By the time everything kicked off is 6. But if you go 10 years after that, you're looking at 56, where a lot of people were born. So, then you add another 5 years onto that, you're talking about 1961. So you can see how the timeline kind of connects there between this entire generation that was seeking alternatives. And these alternatives weren't the fact that, gee, America is too prosperous, good, you can buy a house, you can go to college, do all the things you could generally easily do, I think. Certainly didn't happen in my family in the 70s, but the bottom line is that this was much easier then. But why were they revolting against stuff that's fair? Now, we did have the Vietnam War again. Here we come out of World War II, and the next generation after the veterans are going right into Vietnam again. After the fact, of course, the Korean War, which seems to be endless wars because nobody ever finishes anything. So we didn't finish World War II, which is why we have problems today and why we have problems in Asia and everything else now. We never finished that war. So the whole idea is that things are never finished. So, but it's interesting is that we look at this as a modern phenomenon, that somebody goes through this kind of stress and they're traumatized by it and they act weird. Well, this was what happening to that entire generation that didn't talk about it and didn't get help. And how do we know that? Well, we got it from one of the most decorated, most courageous soldier, and there were many in World War II in the Allied armies that go unsung. Their stories are amazing. There's some channel on YouTube that shows these people. Really just mind-blowing what some of these people have done. So the whole idea is that, unfortunately, it doesn't mean anything. It's war. So it doesn't matter because in the end, nobody really cares, and it doesn't mean much, unfortunately. But here we go from the most decorated guy in World War II to state what kind of serious mental problems, how nobody could help him, and that so many of others' friends were suffering as well. Well, that's what created the 60s. Through pain, maybe something good come from it. I'm not sure what came from the 60s. Of course, we went through the 60s and the 70s, and so many things that we take for granted today, from tarot cards to crystals to psychic readings, all these things that are all births from the 60s that brought this up to the common now, and that people have accepted. And of course, it was because of these times that pushed that forward. Now, I'm not sure, but of course, again, you're getting a certain group of people who grasp onto these things and either disgrace it or make them better. So, we have a lot of bad, quote, metaphysical, New Ager type people. We have a lot of bad people, period. What are the alternatives to that? The wonderful, molesting, horrible churches? We're supposed to go there? The great political system? The great uncorrupt government? I mean, where are we supposed to go? So the point is that certainly these people are at least, a little glitch there. At least these people are searching for something different and seeking answers because the traditional doesn't work. And the traditional never works. The problem is now the New Age traditional didn't work too well either. Why? And why is this? Why do we keep changing seats and still be so uncomfortable? Well, because it's the human race. You can change all the seats you want. You can have all the different beliefs. But what happens? You change hats, you change seats, you don't change yourself. You're looking for answers that you only keep in your little corrupt, your little box of stupidity. The whole idea is you keep everything in there and you just take a new toy and make that as bad and as beat up as the old one. That's how life works. I think that's a fascinating insight that few people think about. Until next time.